It was a splendid afternoon in St. Mary Mead, one of those early summer days when the air seemed heavy with lilac and idle laughter. The sun gilded every rooftop, and even the church spire, usually so solemn, looked a little mischievous under the bright blue sky. The occasion was the annual garden party at the home of Colonel and Mrs. Arthur Bantry, an event regarded as the highlight of the village's modest social calendar. By 3:30, the Bantry garden was alive with activity. Tables were arranged under white awnings, bearing plates of cucumber sandwiches, Victoria sponge, and a rather handsome trifle that Mrs. Price Ridley had been boasting about since Monday. The air buzzed with conversation. Bits of gossip about the new vicar's sermon, speculation over the coming village fete, and whispered judgments on the hat Mrs. Lestrange had chosen to wear. Far too bold, really. Crimson at her age. Miss Marple sat quietly near the rose bushes, teacup in hand, the very picture of amiable contentment. She had been invited, as always, by Mrs. Bantry, who believed a garden party without dear Jane was like tea without sugar. From her shaded seat, Miss Marple watched it all. The little dramas unfolding in smiles, in glances, in the careful way people poured tea for one another. To the untrained eye, it was simply a pleasant gathering. To Miss Marple, it was a study in human nature. The younger guests had gathered near the tennis lawn, where laughter and flirtation mixed like champagne bubbles. Among them was a girl who caught everyone's attention. Not because she was particularly beautiful, though she had a pleasant sort of prettiness, but because she smiled constantly, almost eerily so. Her name, Miss Marple recalled, was Alice Harcourt. 22, recently returned from London, and staying with her uncle, the dour and humourless Dr. Leonard Harcourt, who rarely spoke unless it was to correct someone. Alice's laughter tinkled above the rest, light and musical, and yet there was something just a touch peculiar about it. She laughed too often, smiled too easily. As Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes watched her from beneath her lace parasol, she noted how Alice's eyes didn't quite match her smile. They were too watchful, too alert. "She's a curious one, isn't she?" said Mrs. Bantry, sitting beside Miss Marple, her fan fluttering like the wings of an anxious bird. "Always smiling, always so cheerful. I suppose it's nice to have a bit of youth about, but there's something a bit— oh, what's the word?" "Studied," Miss Marple supplied gently, "as if she's performing happiness." Mrs. Bantry gave a little gasp. "My dear Jane, how morbid of you. Still, you may be right. She's been through rather a lot, poor girl. Lost both parents in that dreadful boating accident on the coast. She's been living with Leonard ever since." Miss Marple nodded slowly. She remembered the newspaper account. The Harcourt's yacht had capsized off Cornwall last year. The father's body had been found, the mother's never recovered. Alice had been abroad at the time, a tragedy to be sure, though one that had elicited a good deal of local sympathy. The party continued in its usual fashion. Polite conversation, little scandals dressed up as news, and children darting between tables. Around 4 o'clock, Mrs. Price Ridley's trifle was finally served, to general acclaim, and Miss Marple found herself listening absently to Colonel Bantry's account of his time in India, while her mind remained quietly alert to the movements of those around her. She noticed Dr. Harcourt standing stiffly near the trellis, speaking to Reverend Lane. His manner was abrupt, his tone clipped, as if the conversation were an unwelcome intrusion upon his thoughts. Meanwhile, Alice danced between groups of guests, smiling here, laughing there. And once, Miss Marple saw her stop quite suddenly, her face momentarily still, as she met the gaze of a tall young man near the gate. He was not from St. Mary Mead. Of that, Miss Marple was certain. His suit was too fine, his shoes too polished, and his air too worldly for village life. The young man inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging a secret between them. Alice's smile returned, brighter than ever, but the hand holding her teacup trembled just enough for Miss Marple to notice. "Who is that young fellow?" Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Bantry peered in the same direction. "Oh, that's Mr. Henry Latham, I believe. Just took the old hall on the edge of town. Something in finance, I think." "Such nice manners." Miss Marple murmured her agreement, though her eyes narrowed slightly. Nice manners could hide all sorts of mischief. As the sun began to dip lower, the party mellowed. Some of the guests began drifting homeward, their laughter softer now, their gossip reserved for the walk back through the lanes. Alice remained by the fountain, still smiling, still radiant, and yet, when Miss Marple glanced again toward her, she found Dr. Harcourt watching his niece with an expression not of affection, but of deep unease. At 5:30, a sudden cry pierced the lazy warmth of the afternoon. It came from the direction of the rose garden. Mrs. Bantry dropped her fan. Several guests gasped. Miss Marple rose slowly, her eyes already narrowing with intuition before her body even followed her mind. 2 young men rushed forward, one of them Henry Latham. Moments later, a small crowd gathered. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry approached, the air suddenly heavy and still. There, lying among the rose petals, was Alice Harcourt. Her eyes were open, her lips curved in the faintest trace of that same haunting smile. But her skin had turned deathly pale, and her teacup lay shattered beside her hand. "She's fainted," cried Mrs. Bantry, though her voice shook. Miss Marple knelt beside the girl, her delicate hand feeling for a pulse that wasn't there. The teacup's contents, faintly pinkish, had spilled into the soil. "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "She hasn't fainted." A hush fell. Dr. Harcourt pushed his way through the onlookers, his face ashen. He knelt beside his niece, but his trembling hands refused to touch her. "She's dead," he whispered hoarsely. "My God, she's dead." Miss Marple stood, her gaze sweeping over the scene. The half-drunk cups, the trifled dishes, the little sugar tongs glinting in the sun. Her eyes lingered on the teapot, the one Alice had filled not half an hour ago, and then she turned her gaze back to the girl who had smiled at everyone, and now, it seemed, smiled even at death itself. Somewhere behind her, a guest murmured, "Who could possibly want to harm her?" Miss Marple did not answer, but her expression, soft as ever, carried a flicker of something cold and knowing, as though she already suspected that in St. Mary Mead no one was quite as innocent as they appeared. By the following morning, the tranquil charm of St. Mary Mead had dissolved entirely. The entire village, from the grocer's wife to the vicar's maid, was alive with rumor. News of Alice Harcourt's death had spread with astonishing speed, faster even than Mrs. Price Ridley could slice her morning toast. Poisoned at the Bantry's garden party, if you can imagine, she declared to anyone who entered the High Street post office, where she had stationed herself under the pretext of mailing a letter. Poor girl. And such a sweet, cheerful thing, too. Always smiling. One wonders who could have done such a wicked thing. To which Mrs. Hartnell, bustling in for stamps, replied darkly, "Smiles can be deceiving. My cousin in Sussex smiled all through her engagement, and 2 days before the wedding, she ran off with the chauffeur. Mark my words, there's more to it than meets the eye." Even the vicar's wife, usually a paragon of restraint, was overheard saying, "It's dreadful to think of, drinking tea one moment and gone the next. One can't help wondering what on earth was in that cup." Meanwhile, the police had descended upon the Bantry estate with a seriousness that made Mrs. Bantry both anxious and secretly flattered. Inspector Graves from Melchester had taken charge, a tall, competent man with a kind face and an unfortunate habit of underestimating elderly women. He interviewed the guests, took statements, and soon formed a picture that seemed, to him, perfectly clear. Alice Harcourt, it appeared, had been alone with her cup of tea for several minutes before she collapsed. No one else had taken from that pot, though several had declined politely when she offered to pour for them. By mid-morning, the official word was whispered from the constable to Mrs. Bantry's cook, and from the cook to her cousin, and from her cousin to the grocer's boy. Arsenic. A small but fatal dose. Miss Marple, however, remained calm through the storm. She had spent the night quietly knitting by her fireside, replaying every moment of the afternoon in her mind. The tremor in Alice's hand, the sharpness in Dr. Harcourt's voice, the stranger's polished shoes by the garden gate. These small impressions, to most people meaningless, were to her the seeds of truth. That morning, she walked to the village shop for a few errands, and found herself intercepted by the Bantry's maid, a flustered young thing named Lucy. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's just awful, it is," Lucy said breathlessly. "All them policemen in the house, walking about as if it were a crime novel. Poor Mrs. Bantry's near in tears. Says she'll never host another party as long as she lives." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "People always say that, my dear. But time has a way of softening even the sharpest shock. Tell me, Lucy, you were serving tea, weren't you? Did you notice whether Miss Harcourt poured her own?" Lucy frowned, thinking hard. "Well, she did, I think. She was at the second table, the one near the roses. Dr. Harcourt was talking to the vicar, so she helped herself. Oh, and that nice Mr. Latham was nearby, too. He offered to fetch her a clean cup, I remember that." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly against each other. "Did he indeed? And did she take it?" Lucy shook her head. "No, ma'am. Said she preferred the one she already had. I thought that queer since it had a chip in it, but she said, 'I'm quite happy with this one.' Just like that, all smiles." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with quiet curiosity. A small detail, but sometimes such things matter a great deal. By noon, Inspector Graves had called upon Miss Marple. Not for advice, naturally, but for confirmation of her witness statement. Still, he could not help but be faintly uneasy under her gentle, unblinking gaze. "You're quite sure, Miss Marple," he said, "that no one else drank from that same pot?" "As sure as I can be," she replied mildly. "Though I do think it odd that the girl poured for herself, don't you? So many people were eager to play host that afternoon." Graves looked puzzled. "Odd? Why odd?" "Because," Miss Marple said, folding her hands, "Miss Harcourt didn't strike me as the sort of girl who did anything for herself if she could persuade someone else to do it. Rather the contrary, in fact. She had a talent for letting people serve her, a charming trait if one doesn't examine it too closely." Graves scribbled a note, half listening. "We'll have to question everyone again. Her uncle, Dr. Harcourt in particular. You'd think a man of medicine might have noticed something wrong." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "You'd think so." After the inspector left, Miss Marple took her tea in the sitting room and gazed out at the lane. Across the road, Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Weatherby were already deep in conversation, their heads bent together like crows over a shiny trinket. The gossip would be dreadful, of course. But gossip, Miss Marple knew, often carried small fragments of truth hidden between exaggerations. Indeed, that afternoon at the village tea-room, the whispers reached fever pitch. "Dr. Harcourt was terribly strict with her," Mrs. Hartnell said, lowering her voice dramatically. "I heard from my sister's friend that he disapproved of her London acquaintances. They say she came home after a dreadful quarrel. Something about money or, well, men." "Men?" gasped Mrs. Price Ridley. "Oh, yes. There was some talk of a broken engagement, some gentleman of means, or perhaps not so much means, since he disappeared soon after." The women shuddered deliciously at the scandal. Miss Marple, seated 2 tables away with her scone, appeared not to listen, but her eyes flickered at the mention of the broken engagement. She had seen such stories before. Young women returning home from London often brought with them the remnants of lives they could not quite explain. Later that evening, she paid a polite call to Mrs. Bantry. The poor woman was distraught, her nerves frayed from police questions and well-meaning callers. "It's such a dreadful business, Jane," she said, wringing her hands. "To think it happened here, in my garden. Arthur says it'll take weeks for people to stop whispering. And poor Dr. Harcourt. He looks like a ghost. Do you think he's hiding something?" Miss Marple hesitated. "I think grief and guilt can look very much alike, Dolly. Sometimes it's difficult to tell one from the other until one knows what lies behind them." Mrs. Bantry sniffled. "But surely someone must have seen something. You're so good at noticing, Jane. Did anything strike you as odd?" Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Several things, actually. The young man, Mr. Latham, seemed to know Miss Harcourt before the party, though neither mentioned it. And then there's the curious matter of that chipped cup. She chose it deliberately. I wonder why." Mrs. Bantry blinked. Perhaps she was sentimental. "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, though she didn't sound convinced. When she returned home that night, the village lay under a stillness that felt almost too heavy, as though the air itself held its breath. She sat once more by her window, the lamps dim, her knitting untouched. Somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed 10. Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the stars, her expression mild, almost wistful. "Yes," she murmured to herself. "People smile for all sorts of reasons. But when they smile at death, it usually means they've seen it coming." The next morning brought a light drizzle to St. Mary Mead, the kind that softened the outlines of hedgerows and made the world appear as though viewed through gauze. Yet even the gentle rain could not wash away the tension that had settled over the village. Curtains twitched as the constable's boots squelched through the mud toward the Harcourt residence, a handsome, ivy-draped house set just beyond the churchyard, where sorrow seemed to hang as thickly as the mist. Miss Marple, ever discreet, was not one to go calling during a time of grief, but she did happen to be on her morning walk, purely by habit, of course, when she happened to pause near the Harcourt's gate. From that vantage, she observed a rather strained conversation between Dr. Harcourt and Inspector Graves, who stood on the doorstep beneath his dripping hat. "You'll forgive me, Doctor," Graves was saying, his tone steady, "but we have to ask questions about your niece's affairs, her acquaintances, her habits, anything that might help us determine who could have wanted her harm." Dr. Harcourt's face was drawn and pale. "I tell you, Inspector, she had no enemies. None that I know of. Alice was—" he faltered. "She was spirited, yes, but harmless. Whatever she did in London, it was behind her. She wanted a fresh start." Graves tilted his head. "And did she speak of anyone recently? Any visitors? I understand a Mr. Henry Latham has taken the hall nearby." The doctor hesitated a fraction too long. Yes, I know of him, met him once or twice. But my niece barely knew the man." Miss Marple's lips pursed in quiet thought. "Barely," she murmured under her breath, her way of remembering the tremor she'd seen in Alice's hand when she'd looked at that very same man. Graves took his leave soon after, and Dr. Harcourt retreated into his house, closing the door with weary finality. Miss Marple turned away, continuing her walk, though her mind was far from the path beneath her sensible shoes. That afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Lane, arrived with the sort of expression one wore when pretending to make a social call, but quite determined to extract information. "My dear Miss Marple," she began, settling herself in the parlour, "I do hope I'm not intruding. Such dreadful weather and such dreadful circumstances. Poor Alice. I can't stop thinking about her." Miss Marple poured tea with unhurried grace. "A tragedy indeed. You saw her that afternoon, did you not?" "I did, though I confess I didn't know her well. But you know how young people are, always with secrets. I do wonder what possessed her to return home so suddenly. And her uncle, such a severe man. One can only imagine the atmosphere in that house." Miss Marple nodded gently. Sometimes the most respectable homes conceal the deepest silences. It can be quite suffocating for a spirited young woman. Mrs. Lane leaned forward. Between you and me, the inspector seems to think it might have been suicide. Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. Suicide? How curious. Well, she poured her own tea, didn't she? And they say the arsenic could have come from her uncle's medical supplies. You don't think she— Miss Marple interrupted softly. If one wished to end one's life, my dear, one rarely chooses to do it in the middle of a garden party surrounded by acquaintances. It is not, shall we say, the usual setting for despair. Mrs. Lane blinked. No, perhaps not. Oh, but they do say grief makes people peculiar. Losing both parents must have been dreadful. Yes, Miss Marple said. Dreadful indeed. Especially if the grief wasn't entirely what it appeared to be. Mrs. Lane looked puzzled. Whatever do you mean? Oh, nothing of importance, Miss Marple replied mildly. Sugar? By the time Mrs. Lane departed, Miss Marple had confirmed what she already suspected. The village was beginning to shape its own story. Some believed it suicide, others whispered of Dr. Harcourt's experiments, and a few, like Mrs. Price Ridley, were quite certain it was the work of the mysterious Mr. Latham, who was, as she said, entirely too handsome to be trustworthy. Later that day, Miss Marple decided to pay a call on the Bantrys, ostensibly to return a book, though in truth she was curious to see the garden again. It had rained lightly that morning, leaving everything glistening, even the patch of earth where the roses grew. Mrs. Bantry greeted her with open arms, clearly relieved to have someone sensible in the house. It feels dreadful, Jane. I can't bear to look at those roses. Poor Alice, lying there as if she'd just fallen asleep. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the area, every detail etched into her precise memory. Tell me, Dolly, did you notice where Mr. Latham went after it happened? Mrs. Bantry frowned, thinking hard. He rushed forward with Colonel Melchett and the others, I believe. Then I remember him stepping back, looking quite ill, actually. Oh, and he left rather early, before the police arrived. Said he wasn't feeling well. Did he now? Said Miss Marple softly. They walked toward the tea tables, now cleared away and stacked neatly beneath the terrace awning. Mrs. Bantry shuddered. It's horrid to think of poison in such a lovely setting. The inspector says the cup had traces of arsenic, but how could it have got there? Miss Marple bent slightly, examining the patch of tablecloth that still bore the faint outline of a spill. A most curious question indeed. I do wonder, Dolly. Was that cup part of your own set? Oh yes, the rose-patterned ones. Arthur and I bought them in Bath. But one of them was chipped. That's the one Alice used. And you say she chose it herself? She insisted, actually. I told her I'd fetch her another, but she laughed and said, it's perfect as it is. I thought she was being charming. Miss Marple straightened, her eyes thoughtful. Yes, charming. That evening, after supper, Miss Marple wrote a small note and sent it to Inspector Graves. It was polite, precise, and phrased as only Miss Marple could manage. A gentle suggestion that perhaps it would be worthwhile to speak again with Mr. Latham, and to ask whether he had ever known Alice Harcourt before her return to St. Mary Mead. Not an accusation, of course, just an observation. The next day, Graves appeared on Miss Marple's doorstep, hat in hand, looking faintly sheepish. You have a knack for being right, Miss Marple. We made some inquiries about Latham. Turns out he did know Miss Harcourt in London. Quite well, in fact. They were engaged for a brief period, though it was called off abruptly. Miss Marple's face betrayed no surprise. How very interesting. And did she end it, or he? He did. Seems he found out she'd been less than honest about her finances. Ran up debts in his name, that sort of thing. He lost a fair bit of money over it. Ah, Miss Marple said softly. A broken engagement and a broken pride. A dangerous combination. Graves nodded grimly. He claims they'd made peace, That she'd written asking to meet. Said he didn't know she'd be at the party until he saw her. And yet, Miss Marple mused, he stayed long enough to watch her die. The inspector looked uncomfortable. You think he did it? I think, said Miss Marple gently, that people sometimes mistake revenge for justice, and that both can wear a very polite face. As Graves departed, Miss Marple returned to her armchair and resumed her knitting. Her needles moved with quiet precision, her mind weaving patterns far more intricate than the wool between her hands. Outside, the drizzle began again, soft and persistent, as though the village itself were whispering secrets Miss Marple already suspected. The inquest was held 3 days later in the parish hall, a modest stone building usually reserved for knitting circles, flower shows, and the occasional dramatic reading. But that morning it was filled to capacity. Everyone in St. Mary Mead, from the postmaster to the milkman's wife, had turned up, each under the noble pretense of civic duty, but all eager to see who would be accused. Inspector Graves presided beside the coroner, and the atmosphere was thick with curiosity. The villagers whispered among themselves in a hush that was not quite respectful. Mrs. Price Ridley sat in the front row, armed with her lorgnette, while Colonel Bantry and his wife occupied the row behind, their faces grave. Miss Marple, seated near the back, looked perfectly serene. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and her expression gave nothing away, though her mind, sharp as a needle, was already unraveling what others had only begun to suspect. Dr. Leonard Harcourt was the first to give evidence. His voice trembled slightly as he described the day's events. His niece's high spirits, her laughter, the shock of seeing her lifeless on the grass. She was healthy, he said stiffly. No ailments of any kind. It must have been deliberate poisoning. You mean suicide, Doctor? Asked the coroner. The doctor hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the crowd. No, he said at last, his voice rough. No, I don't believe she would have done such a thing. Inspector Graves leaned forward. And yet the arsenic came from your medical cabinet, did it not? The murmur that swept through the room was audible and delicious. Mrs. Price Ridley nearly dropped her lorgnette. My cabinet is locked, Dr. Harcourt said sharply. Only I possess the key. But your niece lived with you, Graves persisted. Had she ever access to it? No, said Harcourt flatly. Never. I'm not careless with dangerous substances. Miss Marple's eyes, pale and thoughtful, observed him carefully. He was angry. Not at the accusation, but at something deeper. Fear, perhaps. Or shame. The next to speak was Mr. Henry Latham. The villagers leaned forward with interest. Even the coroner's assistant adjusted his spectacles. Latham, tall and composed in a dark suit, looked every inch the gentleman. He spoke clearly and without hesitation. I knew Miss Harcourt some time ago, he said. We were close friends in London, but the engagement was broken off more than a year ago. I hadn't expected to see her again. Were you surprised to find her at the Bantrys? Graves asked. Very. I had taken the hall only recently. I was invited by Colonel Bantry as a neighbourly gesture. Did you speak with her that day? Yes, briefly. She seemed pleased to see me. We exchanged a few polite words, that's all. Graves' tone hardened. And yet you left before the police arrived. Latham's jaw tightened. I was unsettled. I didn't wish to be in the way. When I realized she was dead, I suppose I panicked. A rustle of whispers swept through the hall. Miss Marple remained still, watching his hands. They were elegant, well-kept hands. But as he spoke, one finger tapped repeatedly against the rail before him. Nervous, yes, but not fearful. No, there was something controlled about it, like a man accustomed to masking his true thoughts. Did you drink any tea that day, Mr. Latham? No. Did you pour any? Latham hesitated. Only for Miss Harcourt. I offered to fetch her a new cup, but she refused." "That was considerate of you," said Graves dryly. "And when she refused, you left it at that?" "Of course," Latham replied. "Did you notice anything unusual about her?" He hesitated again. She seemed strained, perhaps, nervous. But that wasn't unusual for Alice. She was. He paused, searching for a polite word. She was emotional. Miss Marple almost smiled. There was always a certain kind of man who described women that way when what they meant was unpredictable. The inquest continued, calling the servants Mrs. Bantry, the vicar's wife. Each added a layer of observation, but nothing decisive. The coroner's summation was cautious. Death by arsenic poisoning, but the means and intent undetermined. Outside, when it was all over, the villagers poured into the churchyard in a fever of speculation. "Mark my words," said Mrs. Price Ridley. It was the uncle. "Those medical men always have strange notions about family honor. Perhaps she threatened to disgrace him." "Oh no, it was the London man," Mrs. Hartnell countered. "She must have written him letters. Women always do. And if she threatened him with exposure—" Miss Marple, standing quietly by the lich gate, caught fragments of these theories but contributed none. Instead, she watched as Dr. Harcourt and Latham crossed paths at the gate, an encounter small enough to escape notice by most. They did not speak, but the tension between them was unmistakable. Harcourt's eyes burned with a kind of restrained fury, while Latham's expression was cool, faintly mocking. Miss Marple tucked that image away. It was, as she would later think of it, the moment the threads began to knot. That evening, Inspector Graves paid her a visit again, his notebook filled with scribbles and doubts. "We've confirmed the arsenic came from the doctor's cabinet," he said, "but we can't prove he took it. His niece might have done so without his knowledge. Or someone else might have taken it with his knowledge," Miss Marple said softly. Graves frowned. "You mean to suggest he lent it out?" "Not lent, perhaps," she said mildly. "But if a man wishes to protect his reputation, or another's, he might allow a small deception to stand, so long as it benefits him." The inspector sighed. "You think he's guilty?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that both men are lying, but for entirely different reasons." He rubbed his temples. "And you base that on what exactly?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Human nature, Inspector. I've known too many people to mistake a man's pride for innocence or his calm for virtue." Graves looked both exasperated and impressed. "Well, we'll have to question them again. There's also something else. We found a letter in Miss Harcourt's room. It was torn, but it appears to have been written to Mr. Latham. It said only, 'You cannot run from what you did.' I have proof." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Proof? How very inconvenient for him." "Unless," said Graves slowly, "she was bluffing." Miss Marple's gaze turned inward. "Bluffs are dangerous things, Inspector, especially when played against someone who knows the game better than you." When he left, Miss Marple sat long into the evening, the lamplight soft upon her face. She thought of the chipped teacup, of the girl's steady smile, of the doctor's trembling hand, and the man who had walked away too soon. Outside, the village lights flickered one by one into darkness, and in that darkness, Miss Marple saw clearly the outlines of deceit, faint, delicate, but taking shape like embroidery beneath her knowing eye. She set down her knitting and whispered, "Oh yes, we've found our first suspects, but I rather think the truth will prove far uglier than either of them suspect." The following morning, St. Mary Mead buzzed like a disturbed beehive. The death of Lily Harrow had been the talk of the evening before, but now, in the clear light of day, the villagers' fascination had turned to speculation. And speculation in St. Mary Mead was the truest form of social sport. At the post office, Miss Hartnell declared with certainty that it must have been some tramp from the London road. Mrs. Price Ridley, with her usual moral fervour, blamed these modern girls with their makeup and motorbikes. At the Blue Boar, Mr. Finch, the landlord, confided to a sympathetic customer that he'd seen Lily looking right queer-like only a week ago. But it was at the vicarage tea that afternoon, where Miss Marple found herself once again in quiet company, that the first true suspicion began to form. "Inspector Graves came by this morning," Reverend Leonard Clement was saying, stirring his tea distractedly. "A sensible man, though perhaps a little too fond of his own theories. He's convinced it was suicide." Mrs. Clement gasped. "Suicide? Oh, but that's absurd. A girl like Lily, so bright, so full of laughter." Miss Marple raised her eyes mildly from her knitting. "Yes," she said softly, "and yet sometimes the brightest of smiles can be worn by those in the deepest distress. Though," she paused, looping a bit of blue yarn, "I rather doubt it was so simple." The vicar frowned. "You don't think—" "Oh, I think nothing certain, dear vicar," Miss Marple said gently. "But poison seldom finds its way into a person's system accidentally. And Lily Harrow was not the sort to take her own life quietly in a garden she loved." Outside, a shadow moved across the lawn. It was Inspector Graves himself, making his way up the path, his expression one of polite determination. "Ah, Miss Marple," he greeted upon entering, removing his hat. "Good to see you as sharp as ever. I wonder if I might borrow your insight, unofficially, of course." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, "though I dare say you've already some ideas of your own." Graves smiled tightly. "We all have to start somewhere. The doctor's report confirms digitalis poisoning, a good dose too. No sign of it in her possession. However, she'd been friendly with the apothecary's assistant, a young fellow named Tom Hewitt." Mrs. Clement set down her cup. "Tom Hewitt, he's such a quiet young man." "Quiet," the inspector said, "but not unobserved. He's been seen walking out with Miss Harrow in the evenings. Some say she toyed with him, that she was fond of making him jealous. He had access to the very medicine that killed her." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Ah, jealousy," she murmured. "A most potent poison in itself." The inspector nodded. "We've taken him in for questioning. Says he knows nothing about the bottle. But, well, there's always the matter of motive." Miss Marple looked up, eyes gentle, yet keen. "And what of Miss Harrow's friends at the fete?" "Several of them had words with her that day," Graves admitted. "Mrs. Northcott claims she saw Lily quarrelling with someone behind the flower tent. Can't say who, though. Her eyesight isn't what it was." Mrs. Clement nodded gravely. "The poor woman hasn't recognized me in church for months." "Quite," said Graves. "Still, we'll follow up. Oh, and Miss Harrow's employer, Lady Denham, mentioned some unpleasantness at her house last week. Something about a missing brooch. I'll be speaking to her next." After the inspector left, the room was filled with the faint ticking of the clock and the rustle of Miss Marple's knitting. "I do wonder," she said finally, "why it is that young people imagine the heart is ever private. It is the most public of organs, I find. It so often betrays itself in ways others fail to see." Mrs. Clement looked curious. "Do you think young Tom is guilty, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear, I think Tom Hewitt is a very silly young man, but silliness does not often lead to murder. Vanity, perhaps, fear, even pride, but not silliness." That evening, Miss Marple paid a call at the village chemist. Mr. Reeves, the proprietor, was just closing up when she arrived, and though surprised, he welcomed her kindly. "I hear you've lost your assistant," she said mildly. Mr. Reeves sighed. "A pity that. Tom's a good boy. Or was. The police have him down at the station. I told them myself. There's no way he'd touch digitalis unless he was told. He's not clever enough to think of such things." "Not clever," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "But fond of Miss Harrow, wasn't he?" "Oh, very. Used to fetch her parcels, help her mend the garden gate, always hanging about. She was kind to him, but, well, she had other admirers, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple nodded. "I see. And who might they be?" Mr. Reeves hesitated. "There's that Mr. Larch, the gentleman staying at the Denham cottage. Charming sort, bit of a mystery to everyone. And then, of course, there's young Captain Denham himself, engaged to a London lady, but the way he looked at Miss Harrow, I wouldn't have wagered much on his fidelity." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Men do so often imagine themselves immune to gossip, but St. Mary Mead has a most reliable memory." When she returned home, twilight had deepened into indigo. The lamplight glowed softly in her sitting room as she set down her gloves and hat. On the mantelpiece, the silver-framed photograph of her late nephew Raymond caught her eye. "It's always the same, dear boy," she said quietly. "The heart leads where the head dares not follow, and the price is always rather dear." The next morning, a new piece of gossip swept through the village. Tom Hewitt had been released. The inspector, it seemed, had found a witness who claimed to have seen Lily alive after Tom had left her at the fete. And now, rumor whispered, suspicion had shifted to someone with far more to lose than a lovesick assistant. Miss Marple smiled softly into her teacup. "Ah," she said to herself, "now the real story begins." The morning after Tom Hewitt's release dawned with a deceptive stillness, as though St. Mary Mead had momentarily held its breath. The mist hung low over the hedgerows, and dew clung to the rose petals in Miss Marple's garden like scattered diamonds. Yet beneath that quiet surface, whispers already stirred, the kind that slithered from doorstep to doorstep, finding their way to the vicarage and the post office alike. Tom was free, yes, but not exonerated. The village had merely shifted its gaze elsewhere. At breakfast, Miss Marple read the morning paper without really seeing it. Her mind was upon Lily Harrow, her radiant smile, her easy laughter, and that faintly melancholy air that had seemed to cling to her even in joy. She had observed the girl often at the post office and occasionally in the grocer's, and had once thought, quite privately, that Lily's gaiety had the brittle edge of a cracked teacup. Now that fragile brightness had shattered entirely. She folded the paper neatly, rose, and crossed to the window. Through the lace curtain she could see Mr. Larch strolling down the lane toward the vicarage, his hat tilted at a careless angle. He was handsome, undeniably so, and yet there was something in his smile, something calculated, as though he had practiced it before a mirror. Miss Marple frowned slightly. She had lived too long in St. Mary Mead not to recognize the subtle art of charm used as armor. Later that morning, she paid a visit to Mrs. Price Ridley under the pretext of discussing the upcoming church bazaar. The conversation, of course, swiftly turned to Lily Harrow. "Such a shocking business," Mrs. Price Ridley said, leaning forward eagerly. "And to think, she was seen speaking to Mr. Larch not an hour before she died. Mrs. Northcote swears she heard raised voices. I do believe the man's quite capable of anything." Miss Marple sipped her tea calmly. "Mrs. Northcote's ears, I fear, are not what they once were. But it is curious, isn't it, that Lily was alone in the garden after so public a fate? Most young ladies prefer an audience for their quarrels." Mrs. Price Ridley blinked. "Well, I suppose, though one never knows what secrets such girls keep." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly, setting down her cup. "But secrets do have a way of leaving traces, if one only knows where to look." That afternoon, she took a quiet walk to the vicarage garden, where the fete had been held. The place was eerily peaceful now, the bunting gone, the grass still faintly marked by the footprints of the crowd. She wandered to the edge of the lawn, where a few trampled flowers marked the spot of Lily's collapse. She knelt carefully, her gloved fingers brushing the earth. There, caught among the grass stems, was a small curved object, a pearl button. old-fashioned, the sort used on fine gloves or evening dresses. She slipped it into her handkerchief before anyone might see. Rising, she noticed something else, a faint indentation in the soil, as if a heel had pressed there with force, and beside it, a scuffed mark, as though someone had stumbled or been dragged slightly backward. Her eyes softened with comprehension. "A quarrel," she murmured, "and not an even one." At that moment, footsteps sounded behind her. Turning, she saw Inspector Graves approaching, his expression grim. "Miss Marple," he greeted, doffing his hat. "You've beaten me to it again. Thought I might take another look around. I've spoken with Lady Denham. Seems she had a quarrel of her own with the girl." Miss Marple tilted her head. "About the missing brooch?" "Exactly. Gold, with a ruby centre. Lily denied taking it, of course, but Lady Denham was livid. Claims she meant to dismiss the girl the very next day." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple murmured. "And yet, she did not seem the sort to steal. Did Lady Denham ever recover it?" Graves hesitated. "Not yet. But there's another matter. Lily had written a letter that morning to someone in London. We found it half finished in her room. It began, 'My dearest,' and stopped there. No name." "Ah," said Miss Marple, her eyes distant. "Love, again." She watched the inspector depart, then walked slowly home. There, in the quiet of her parlour, she drew out the pearl button and examined it under the lamplight. Fine craftsmanship. Not from a shop Lily could have afforded. And not, Miss Marple thought, from any glove she had seen the girl wear. But she had seen such buttons before. On the gloves of Lady Denham herself, at church, gleaming against the ivory of her sleeves. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, thoughtful frown. The wealthy widow of Colonel Denham was a formidable woman, imperious, quick-tempered, and fond of her jewels. But poison, that seemed beneath her dignity, unless, of course, it had been administered without her direct hand. The next day, she attended morning service at the church where Lady Denham was, as ever, seated prominently in the front pew. Afterward, Miss Marple approached her, smiling benignly. "My dear Lady Denham, such dreadful times we live in. Poor Miss Harrow. Such a tragedy." Lady Denham sniffed. "A foolish girl, Miss Marple. I warned her that deceit would never end well. I dare say she brought it upon herself." Miss Marple's tone remained mild. "So young, and yet so careless. I imagine it must have been difficult, finding good help, especially one so pretty." "Pretty." Lady Denham's lips thinned. "Pretty girls are more trouble than they're worth. I shall employ a matronly housekeeper next time, someone too sensible for moonlight meetings in the garden." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Moonlight meetings do seem to invite unfortunate endings. Tell me, my dear, did you ever find that lovely ruby brooch of yours?" Lady Denham hesitated. "No," she said sharply. "But I shall. Mark my words, Miss Marple. Thieves always reveal themselves." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, eyes kind but keen. "They always do." When Lady Denham swept off toward her carriage, Miss Marple watched her go. Thoughtful. She knew now that the brooch, the quarrel, and the letter were all threads of the same tapestry. But the pattern was not yet clear. That evening, while visiting the vicarage once more, Miss Marple mentioned the button she had found. Reverend Clement looked puzzled, but Mrs. Clement gasped softly. "Pearl buttons? Why, I remember seeing Lady Denham lose one at last year's garden party. She complained that her maid hadn't sewn it back properly." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, dear, some things are easily mended. Others, less so." As she walked home beneath the twilight sky, she pondered the mystery of Lily's smile, that bright, fragile thing that had hidden so much. And at last, a realization began to take shape, delicate yet unshakable. There had been more than one secret in that garden, and one of them, she now suspected, was still alive. and watching. By the next morning, the calm of St. Mary Mead was once again an illusion. A thin veneer of civility spread over a churning sea of rumour. Beneath the sound of garden shears and the ringing of shop bells, whispers moved like smoke. Lady Denham's quarrel with Lily Harrow, the mysterious letter, the pearl button that Miss Marple alone had noticed. Miss Marple herself, seated by her window with a teapot and her knitting, was thinking, not of gossip, but of patterns. Human patterns, which were, to her mind, much like the stitches she so patiently looped. One dropped or twisted strand, and the whole design began to reveal its secret shape. She was interrupted mid-thought by a brisk knock at the door. Opening it, she found Inspector Graves, hat in hand, looking more harried than usual. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said. "I hope I'm not intruding. There's been a development." "Oh dear," said Miss Marple, ushering him in. "Do sit down, Inspector. You look as though you've been walking in circles." He sighed, accepting the tea she offered. "You could say that. We've found Lady Denham's missing brooch." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh? Where was it hiding itself?" "In Lily Harrow's room," Graves said grimly. "Inside a small wooden box on her dresser, wrapped neatly in a handkerchief with her initials embroidered on it. Looks rather damning, doesn't it?" Miss Marple set down her cup, her movements delicate, deliberate. "Yes," she said slowly. "It looks damning, which is quite a different thing from being damning, wouldn't you agree?" Graves frowned. "You mean it could have been planted?" "Or borrowed," Miss Marple murmured. "Or perhaps even given. Appearances are rarely to be trusted, Inspector, especially when pride is involved." Graves rubbed the back of his neck. "Lady Denham's practically crowing. Says she knew it all along, but there's something else. We've confirmed that Lily sent a letter to London, addressed to a Mr. R. Larch. He denies ever receiving it, of course." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "So Mr. Larch has graduated from mysterious stranger to reluctant correspondent." The inspector gave her a sharp look. "You've been thinking about him too, then?" "Indeed," Miss Marple replied. "A man who smiles too easily is rather like a cat that purrs too loudly. One must always wonder what he's hiding." When Graves departed, Miss Marple reached for her cardigan and hat. She felt that a stroll to Lady Denham's estate might prove illuminating. The Denham residence, a fine Georgian manor fringed with yew hedges, stood proudly aloof from the rest of the village. Lady Denham received her visitor with thin-lipped courtesy. "Miss Marple," she said coolly, "you've come to congratulate me, I suppose? The inspector tells me they've found my brooch." "I did hear that, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "And such a relief it must be to have the matter settled. I confess I never thought poor Lily a thief." Lady Denham's expression hardened. "You're far too trusting, Miss Marple. The girl deceived everyone. She played the innocent while cavorting with that dreadful man Larch, and all the while robbing me under my own roof." Miss Marple's eyes were mild, but her voice was thoughtful. "I dare say she might have been foolish, yes. But deceit takes planning, and planning requires calm. Did she strike you as calm, my dear Lady Denham?" Lady Denham hesitated. "She was agitated that last week, I'll admit. Frightened, even. I thought it was guilt." "Or fear," Miss Marple murmured. "And sometimes the two are easily mistaken." Lady Denham's hand twitched, fingers tightening around her teacup. "You have a strange way of defending the dead, Miss Marple. I don't care what she feared. She's brought nothing but scandal upon this house." "Scandal," Miss Marple said softly, a very old friend of pride. When Miss Marple took her leave, she paused at the end of the drive, looking back at the tall windows of the Denham house. She thought of the pearl button, of the missing brooch, and of Lily's frightened eyes that had seen something too dangerous to speak aloud. That evening, at the vicarage, a small gathering had formed. The Reverend and Mrs. Clement, Inspector Graves, and, to Miss Marple's mild surprise. Mr. Larch himself. The inspector had summoned him for a few clarifications. Mr. Larch was as smooth as ever. "I've told you all I know," he said, lighting a cigarette. Poor girl was infatuated. I did nothing to encourage her. "Yet she wrote to you," Miss Marple said quietly. "Addressed you by name." Larch's gaze flicked toward her, wary. A misunderstanding. I'd given her advice once about a position in London. She must have thought me a friend. "How very noble," Miss Marple murmured. "And did you know she had been accused of theft?" "Only after the fact," he said briskly. "Frankly, I'm not surprised. She was desperate for money. Talked of wanting to leave the village. Said she'd found herself in a difficult situation." Mrs. Clement gasped softly. "A situation?" Larch shrugged. "A young woman's folly. I hardly think it relevant to her death." Miss Marple's gaze was gentle but steady. "Oh, but everything is relevant, Mr. Larch, especially when a young woman's folly is paid for in poison." He stiffened slightly, then gave a short laugh. "You can't possibly think—" But Miss Marple interrupted him, her tone as mild as ever. "I think only that the truth has a habit of lingering where lies try to cover it. And I believe, Mr. Larch, that you are not quite as unaffected by Lily Harrow's death as you pretend." For a moment, silence reigned. Then the inspector cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "That'll be all for now, Mr. Larch. Don't leave the village without notifying me." When the man was gone, Mrs. Clement whispered, "Miss Marple, do you truly think he—" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think Mr. Larch is a man accustomed to admiration, and Lily Harrow was no longer admiring him. That can be a dangerous thing for some men." Later, as Miss Marple walked home under a pale moon, she replayed the evening in her mind. Mr. Larch's polished denial, Lady Denham's trembling hand, the brooch found where it should not have been. Each detail was like a note in a melody she knew but could not yet hum aloud. Near her gate, she paused, frowning. The latch, which she always kept fastened, hung loosely open. Someone had been there. She entered quietly. Nothing appeared disturbed, save for one thing. On her sitting-room table beside the teapot lay a single pearl button, cleaned, polished, and placed there deliberately. Miss Marple stood very still, the faintest of smiles touching her lips. "So," she whispered, "someone wishes to warn me, or frighten me." She closed the curtains, locked the door, and set the button upon her mantel beside the first one she'd found. 2 clues now, twin glimmers of deceit, and in her gentle, unwavering way, Miss Marple knew. The killer had just revealed themselves. The morning sun rose pale and weary, its light bleeding weakly across the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, as though even the heavens hesitated to shine upon a village so entangled in deceit. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table, her tea untouched, her eyes lost in the quiet, swirling steam. The evidence lay before her, notes, timelines, and names, each piece like a fragment of a puzzle that refused to settle. There was something terribly wrong beneath the calm surface. She could feel it, the heaviness in the air, the too polite glances exchanged between neighbors, the unease that curled at the edges of every conversation. It was as if a veil had been drawn over the truth, and beneath it, something dark shifted restlessly. Colonel Melrose had stopped by earlier that morning, his face grave. "Miss Marple," he'd said, removing his hat respectfully, "I've just come from the inspector. He's of the opinion that we've been looking at the wrong motive entirely." "Oh?" she'd asked, her voice light, but her mind sharpening instantly. "Yes. The letter Mrs. Harrow received before her death. It's been analyzed. The handwriting doesn't match anyone in the village. Seems it was meant to look like a blackmail note, but in truth, it's a forgery." Miss Marple's teacup had trembled slightly as she set it down. "So the note was planted," Precisely. A red herring, as the inspector says. Someone wanted us to believe she was being blackmailed, but there's no trace of such a thing. Not in her bank statements, not in her letters. Nothing. After he left, Miss Marple had sat for a long while, thinking. A forged letter, a missing piece of jewelry, a sudden death followed by silence and suspicion. Then, like the slow unfurling of a flower, a thought bloomed. The letter had been meant to divert, but from what? She decided to take a walk. The air was crisp and the village was stirring awake. She passed the post office, the bakery, and the vicarage. Her steps were slow but deliberate. She watched the people she passed, Mrs. Price fussing over her roses, young Tommy delivering milk, Miss Weatherby peering nervously from her window, all living their small, ordinary lives, or appearing to. She found herself near the old Harrow cottage, its windows still shuttered. The gate creaked as she touched it. For a moment, she simply stood there, listening. The wind rustled through the ivy that crept along the stone. A crow called from the roof, its cry sharp and hollow. She bent slightly, her sharp eyes catching something glinting in the dirt near the garden path. A small metal clasp, polished, deliberately dropped or overlooked. She slipped it into her handkerchief and tucked it away, her expression unreadable. As she turned to leave, a voice startled her. "Out for a stroll, Miss Marple." It was Lydia Graves, the Harrow's former maid, now working for the vicar's wife. Her tone was sweet, but her eyes flickered with something wary. "Indeed, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "A bit of morning air does wonders for the mind." Lydia hesitated. "Strange thing, you know. How quiet it's been since Mrs. Harrow's death. The birds don't seem to sing the same way." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "Grief changes the sound of the world, I've always thought. You worked for her, did you not?" "For 3 years," Lydia said, glancing down. "She was kind, mostly. A bit secretive, though. Always receiving letters she didn't want anyone else to see." "Letters?" "Yes, ma'am. Thick ones. From London, I think. She'd burn them straight away after reading. Said they were private business matters." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And yet one wonders what sort of business a woman in her situation might conduct." Lydia's lips parted as though she might respond, but then she looked away, muttering something about being late for her duties. She hurried off, her steps uneven, her shoulders tense. Miss Marple watched her go. The faint smile faded. Lydia Graves had lied. Her body betrayed her words, and that, Miss Marple knew, was more telling than any confession. Returning home, she laid out the small clasp on her desk beside the letter. It belonged, she thought, to a bracelet or perhaps a locket chain. Either way, it was gold and recently polished, not the sort of thing a maid would own. Her gaze shifted to a photograph pinned to the corner of her desk. Mrs. Harrow at a village fete 2 years ago. Around her wrist gleamed a delicate gold bracelet with a distinctive clasp, the same clasp that now lay before her. Then the pieces began to move in her mind, clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. The forged letter, the missing bracelet, the maid's evasive words. Mrs. Harrow had been hiding something, someone's secret. The letters from London burned before they could be read. Could they have been from a man, or perhaps from someone she meant to protect? And if she was protecting them, what had they done? Miss Marple's heart tightened. It was not blackmail at all. It was fear, fear disguised as secrecy. That evening, as twilight bled across the village, Miss Marple sat knitting by her window, her needles moving rhythmically, her mind alive. She watched as Lydia Graves crossed the green, a basket on her arm. She paused briefly near the post box, slipped something inside and hurried away. Miss Marple rose, her eyes narrowing slightly. When the streets had emptied, she made her way down the lane, her shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders. The post box was cool to the touch. She tilted her head, listening to the wind, and then, very carefully, slipped a gloved hand inside. Her fingers brushed against a sealed envelope. No stamp, no address, only a name written across the front in elegant, practiced script, "For the Reverend." Her breath caught. She withdrew her hand at once and stood still, heart thudding softly. Why would Lydia Graves deliver a secret note to the vicar on the eve of an unsolved murder? And then, from the darkness across the street, a shadow stirred. Someone was watching her. Miss Marple did not turn. She simply smiled faintly to herself, the way one does when the truth begins to take shape. The veil had been lifted, if only slightly. And beneath it, something far more sinister than anyone in St. Mary Mead dared to imagine. The vicarage stood at the edge of St. Mary Mead, wrapped in ivy and silence. By daylight, it was a place of charity and comfort, a home where hymns floated from open windows and the smell of freshly baked bread lingered in the air. But tonight, as the lamps flickered behind curtained glass, there was a strange heaviness to it, as though the walls themselves were keeping secrets. Miss Marple approached quietly, her cane tapping softly on the cobbled path. It was late, and propriety would have kept most villagers home at such an hour, but not Miss Marple. The note Lydia had placed in the post-box could not wait till morning. She was halfway up the path when the door opened. Reverend Paul Whitcomb appeared, startled but polite, his spectacles glinting in the dim light. "Miss Marple, what an unexpected pleasure, at this hour too. I do hope nothing's amiss." "I'm afraid something very much is amiss, Reverend," she said gently. "May I come in?" The vicar hesitated, then stepped aside. "Of course. Do forgive the state of things. Mrs. Whitcomb retired early, and I was just reviewing Sunday's sermon." The study was warm and neat, lined with books and smelling faintly of candle wax and lavender. On the desk lay a small pile of opened correspondence. Miss Marple's gaze flicked over it, noting the recent envelopes, all addressed to the Reverend, all from local parishioners, but none matched the elegant handwriting she had seen on the letter from Lydia. "Reverend," she began softly, "you'll forgive an old woman's curiosity, but I happened to notice something rather peculiar this evening. A letter placed in the post-box near the green. No stamp, no address, simply marked 'For the Reverend.'" His brow furrowed. "That's most curious indeed. I haven't received anything of the sort." Miss Marple studied him. His confusion seemed genuine. "Perhaps not yet," she said, "though it may arrive by morning." He gave a faint smile, adjusting his glasses. "I do appreciate your vigilance, Miss Marple. This business with Mrs. Harrow has everyone on edge. I pray the good inspector will soon resolve it." "Prayer is always wise," she murmured, "but I've found that truth tends to arrive by slower means, often carried by those we least suspect." The Reverend tilted his head. "You think Lydia Graves knows something?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Lydia is afraid, and fear makes people act strangely." The vicar's expression darkened. "She has been unsettled of late. Comes by with excuses, flowers for the church, messages for Mrs. Whitcomb, but never stays long. I thought it grief. Now I'm not so certain." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the small wooden crucifix above the desk. The candlelight threw long shadows across the room. "Tell me, Reverend, did Mrs. Harrow ever confide in you?" He hesitated. In confidence, she spoke of worry, unspoken sins, she called them. She feared that something she knew might cause harm if revealed. I urged her to trust in forgiveness, but she wept and left without another word. Miss Marple's hands folded neatly in her lap, and she died not a week later. A long silence followed. The clock on the mantel ticked with a hollow sound. "I'll tell you something else," the vicar said at last. "The night before she died, I saw her outside the church speaking to a man. It was dark and I could not make out his face, but he wore a dark overcoat. When I called out, they parted at once. She walked home and he disappeared toward the lane." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "A man in a dark coat, not from the village, I suppose?" "No. Tall fellow, broad shoulders. Could have been anyone." She stood, smoothing her shawl. Or someone pretending to be no one at all. The vicar frowned, uncertain of her meaning, but Miss Marple had already drifted toward the door. "Thank you, Reverend. You've been most helpful. I'll see myself out." Outside, the night had grown colder. The mist crept low across the village green, swallowing the path ahead. She drew her shawl tighter and walked with measured steps, her thoughts racing. The letter, the man, the confession of fear. The pattern was forming now, delicate yet clear. Mrs. Harrow had known something she shouldn't have. She had received letters, not of blackmail, but of warning. Lydia Graves had been her messenger, her shield perhaps. And now, someone was trying to silence the truth before it reached the vicar's hands. At that moment, a figure moved at the corner of her vision. Swift, almost soundless. Miss Marple stopped. Her eyes followed the shape as it slipped between hedges, vanishing down the narrow lane that led toward the churchyard. "Ah," she whispered softly. "So we are being watched again." She followed, careful and deliberate, her cane tapping quietly. The lane was shrouded in fog, the stones damp beneath her shoes. The air smelled faintly of earth and candle smoke from evening prayers long finished. Ahead, through the mist, she saw the faint glimmer of a lantern, moving, unsteady. She reached the lich gate and paused, her breath soft in the chill. The churchyard was empty but for the graves and the whisper of wind through the yews. Then she heard it, the faint creak of a door within the vestry. Miss Marple stepped forward, every sense alive. She pushed open the wooden door, its hinges sighing. Inside, the vestry was dim, lit only by a single candle guttering on the table. Papers lay scattered, a drawer half open, and beside it, Lydia Graves, trembling, her hand clutching the very letter Miss Marple had seen earlier. "Miss Marple," she gasped, dropping it at once. "You startled me." "I might say the same of you, my dear," Miss Marple replied calmly. "You do keep late hours for a maid." Lydia's eyes darted toward the open door. I only came to leave a note for the Reverend." "Nothing more." "Indeed." Miss Marple bent and picked up the letter. "This note, perhaps?" The young woman froze. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. "Please, don't read it. It's not what you think." "Then what is it, child?" Tears welled in her eyes. "She told me to. Mrs. Harrow. Before she died, she said if anything happened to her, I must send the vicar this letter, but I couldn't. I was afraid." Miss Marple's voice softened. Afraid of whom? Lydia's gaze flickered to the window, the fog pressing close against the glass. "Of him," she whispered. "The man she met that night. He said she'd ruin everything, that if I spoke, I'd be next." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her arm. "My dear, the danger lies only so long as the truth hides. Whatever this letter holds, it's the key. You must trust that." Lydia hesitated, then nodded. "You'll read it?" "In the morning," Miss Marple said quietly. "By daylight, when shadows lose their teeth." And as the candle burned low, the two women sat in silence, one trembling with guilt, the other calm as a still pond, waiting for dawn and the truth that would finally rise with it. The morning broke over St. Mary Mead with an air of fragile certainty. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, illuminating the small desk where the letter from Lily Harrow lay, carefully opened and spread before her. The words were few but pointed, a warning, a confession, and a fragment of truth meant to expose the person who had orchestrated the calamity that had shattered the village. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully, her knitting untouched for the first time that morning. Outside, the village stirred with its usual quiet diligence. Yet something beneath the surface had shifted. Even the bird's song carried a note of suspense, as though nature itself were aware that revelation was imminent. She had spent the night pondering every detail: the forged letter, the pearl button, Lydia Graves' hesitation, the glimmering clasp, the quarrels between Lady Denham and Lily, and, most tellingly, the man in the dark coat who had haunted the churchyard. Each clue had its place in the mosaic of deception, and now Miss Marple felt ready to bring the final pieces together. The plan was simple, yet subtle, a psychological maneuver rather than a trap of physical danger. She would confront the suspects one by one, guiding them toward the truth not by accusation, but by reflection, observation, and the gentle pressure of inevitability. Her first call was to Lady Denham. The grand old house was quiet, almost expectant, as if it too awaited the unveiling of secrets. Lady Denham received her in the drawing-room, resplendent in pearls, her sharp eyes flicking over Miss Marple as though weighing her intentions. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Lady Denham said smoothly. "I trust you come with news?" "Only reflections, my dear," Miss Marple replied, seating herself comfortably. "I was hoping to discuss Lily Harrow with you. You knew her well." "Of course," Lady Denham said, her tone measured. "A foolish girl, but I liked her in a way, despite her impulsiveness." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Impulsiveness can often be dangerous. One might act without thought of consequences. Do you remember the garden fete?" Lady Denham's lips tightened. "I do. What of it?" "I was thinking of a pearl button, dear, found in the grass that day, and another cleaned and left upon my mantel." Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the micro-expressions, the quick tightening of the jaw, the barely perceptible blink, the way her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her handkerchief. Lady Denham's face hardened. "Pearl buttons, you say? I lost one last year. Hardly seems relevant. Yet sometimes, my dear, the smallest items tell the largest truths," Miss Marple said quietly. "And people sometimes take care to return them or leave them where others might find them." Lady Denham shifted in her seat, her composure intact, but a trace of unease glimmering in her eyes. Miss Marple did not press further. She had set the seed. Next, she sought Mr. Larch. He arrived promptly at the vicarage, confident, polished, and disarmingly polite. "Miss Marple," he greeted, bowing slightly. "I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "I thought we might speak about Lily Harrow. A tragic girl and yet a clever one." Mr. Larch smiled faintly, though his eyes betrayed a hint of apprehension. "Clever, perhaps, but misguided." Miss Marple nodded. "Clever enough to hide things. Clever enough to know danger when she saw it. Clever enough to trust only certain people." She let the words linger, watching him carefully. "For instance, do you recall the letter she sent you, now revealed to have been a forgery? Someone wanted you, and everyone else, to believe she was compromised." Larch's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A tiny flicker, almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple saw it. "Yes, a dreadful trick," he said quickly, "but it proves nothing about anyone here." "True," she said gently. "But tell me, Mr. Larch, do you think one would need to be exceptionally careful if they wished to conceal their hand?" His eyes met hers, sharp, calculating. Yet beneath the surface, Miss Marple saw the brief hesitation, the momentary twitch of conscience or fear. "That is quite enough speculation," he said finally, attempting a laugh. "We must let the police decide." Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet smile. The seed had sprouted. The test was working. Finally, she arranged a small gathering at the vicarage. Lady Denham, Mr. Larch, Reverend Whitcomb, and Lydia Graves. She had carefully orchestrated the seating, the conversation, and the timing. She spoke of Lily in gentle terms, weaving stories of her kindness, her bravery, in the small, unnoticed acts that revealed character. Then, with a subtle pivot, she spoke of the pearl buttons, the clasp, and the letter. She recounted details without accusation, merely observation. Her eyes lingered on each face, noting micro-expressions, the shifting weight of bodies, the flash of unease in hands that clutched skirts or cuffs. "Sometimes," she said softly, "people wish to guide suspicion away from themselves by manipulating others, by planting false evidence, by instilling fear. But fear, as we all know, is not perfect. It leaves traces. It is in the hands, the eyes, the pauses between words." The room was quiet. The air thickened with tension, yet the arrangement seemed innocent. Everyone spoke, laughed lightly, and shared recollections. And yet Miss Marple watched, the tilt of the head, the quick glance toward the vicar's desk, the slight blanch of skin under candlelight. And then, almost imperceptibly, Mr. Larch shifted. His eyes flicked toward the mantel where the second pearl button rested. A hand twitched near his lap. His composure, previously so polished, faltered for the briefest moment. Miss Marple's gaze settled gently upon him. "You see," she said quietly, "there are some truths that cannot be hidden. They slip through the smallest cracks, an object misplaced, a gesture betrayed, a fear too human to contain." Mr. Larch's hands clenched. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence became almost unbearable, and in that moment the truth spoke for itself. Miss Marple allowed a slight pause, her eyes calm and knowing. "Mr. Larch," she said, voice soft but unwavering, "you are the one who orchestrated the events surrounding Lily Harrow's death. The letter, the theft, the fear, each a piece to divert suspicion from yourself. But the smallest details always betray the guilty. And your fear this morning, however brief, has confirmed what the others might not yet see." His face hardened, his jaw set, and yet Miss Marple knew that the weight of inevitability had reached him. I don't know what you mean," he stammered, but it was hollow. Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "The truth is seldom cruel, Mr. Larch. It is merely persistent." She turned her attention to the others in the room, who now watched in dawning comprehension. "And so," she said, her hands folded, "it is resolved. The hidden hand, the calculated deception, the fear, all fall into place. Lily's bravery, the courage of Lydia, and the insight of careful observation have revealed what the shadows sought to conceal." Mr. Larch's face lost its defiance, and the silence settled like a verdict. Miss Marple, her task complete, leaned back and allowed the room to breathe again. She had not raised her voice, nor confronted with harsh accusation, yet the truth, guided with precision, had emerged as naturally as dawn. Outside, the village continued unaware, yet a quiet order had returned. Beneath the gentle English sun, St. Mary Mead had survived another day, and the darkness that had threatened it had been brought into the light. The vicarage sat in calm silence as Miss Marple rose from her chair, her knitting folded neatly on the table beside her. The air was thick with anticipation, though no one spoke, each person waiting for the final understanding that would explain the chaos that had swept through their village. Mr. Larch sat stiffly, his hands pressed into his knees, his eyes flicking from the floor to Miss Marple as if searching for a loophole in her quiet certainty. Miss Marple's gaze travelled across the room, lingering first on Lady Denham. "My dear," she began softly, "we have all been deceived by appearances. Pride, fear, and ambition can mask truth in a manner so subtle that only careful observation may reveal it." Lady Denham's lips pressed together. Curiosity piqued despite herself. "And you have observed, Miss Marple?" "Observed what?" "Much," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle yet firm. "Consider the pearl buttons, for instance. The first found in the grass at the garden fête. A small detail, easily overlooked, and yet it was cleaned and placed upon my mantle. A silent message left intentionally, yet betraying its sender. All eyes turned to her, and Mr. Larcher's mouth twitched in unease. Miss Marple did not flinch. She continued calmly, laying out each piece of evidence in quiet, deliberate sequence. Then there was the letter, supposedly blackmail, sent in Lily Harrow's name. A forgery designed to frighten and misdirect suspicion. Who would benefit from making her appear guilty, while diverting attention from the true hand behind her death? Mr. Larcher's face tightened. He shifted in his seat, but Miss Marple's eyes held his, with the patience of someone unraveling a complicated stitch in her knitting. The clasp, she continued, pointing to the small golden piece she had recovered from the Harrow garden. A fragment of a bracelet, deliberately dropped and polished. A detail meant to confuse, yet it confirmed the connection between the victim and someone with a vested interest in concealing the truth. All of these pieces point to a single source. Someone close enough to understand both her movements and her fears, yet calculating enough to manipulate the village into believing a false narrative. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. The room was utterly still, the only sound the faint ticking of the mantel clock. "Mr. Larch," she said finally, turning her gaze upon him, "you are that source. You visited the churchyard the night before Mrs. Harrow's death. You threatened her through Lydia Graves, instructing her to deliver your fabricated warning in a manner designed to obscure your involvement. You orchestrated the disappearance of Lady Denham's brooch and the placement of the pearl buttons, using them to establish a false trail of guilt." The man's jaw dropped slightly, though he attempted to mask it with a rigid expression. You cannot prove such things," he said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Proof is not always required, Mr. Larch. Human nature often provides it in its most telling forms. Your hesitation when confronted, your attention to the pearl buttons, your glance toward the mantel when the letter was discussed, these were inadvertent confessions. You cannot hide what the mind cannot suppress." Lady Denham gasped softly. Her hands clasped. "So all this time, it was he?" "Yes," Miss Marple said simply. "He believed fear and manipulation would shield him, but the smallest detail, observed with care, can reveal everything." Lily Harrow, though she could not speak freely, left signs for those who would notice. Lydia Graves, despite her terror, unwittingly guided us toward the truth. And finally, the pearls and the clasp spoke silently but clearly to anyone patient enough to watch. The room was quiet, yet charged with the gravity of recognition. Mr. Larcher's defiance faltered, replaced by a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor in his hands. He looked from Miss Marple to Lady Denham, then to the vicar, realizing that every subtlety he had ignored now conspired against him. I had no intention of," he began, but his words trailed off. "You intended to frighten, to mislead, to conceal," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle, almost sorrowful. "But intent alone cannot override the truth. Even a carefully orchestrated plan leaves traces. They may be small, buttons, letters, hesitation, but to a careful observer, they are unmistakable." Reverend Whitcomb nodded solemnly. "It is remarkable, Miss Marple. I had suspected only fragments, but now—" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Now the village understands. Lily Harrow was a young woman caught between loyalty and fear, manipulated by one who underestimated the power of small details and human insight. Her death, tragic as it was, has revealed the character of the man who orchestrated it, and the courage of those who did not remain silent." She turned her attention back to Mr. Larch. "There will be consequences, of course. The law will decide upon action, but understand this: the moral weight of truth cannot be evaded. It exists independently of courts and juries. Even you, Mr. Larch, cannot escape it." The man's shoulders slumped imperceptibly. For the first time, his polished demeanor cracked entirely. The room, once heavy with tension, now carried the quiet relief of clarity. Lady Denham spoke softly. "Miss Marple, you have once again reminded us that nothing is ever truly hidden in this village. Not even the smallest acts can escape notice if one is willing to observe with patience and care. "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "and it is often the smallest and most overlooked things that reveal the greatest truths." Lily Harrow's bravery was not in grand gestures, but in the signs she left for those who knew how to watch. It is a lesson for us all. Lydia Graves, standing quietly near the window, let out a breath she had been holding, her hands trembling. I was so afraid," she whispered. Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Fear is natural, child. Courage is in acting despite it. You helped reveal the truth, and that is a kind of bravery Lily would have valued greatly." The room remained still for a long moment, as though the shadows themselves were listening. Outside, the village stirred again, oblivious to the careful unraveling of deceit within the vicarage walls. Miss Marple finally gathered her knitting and rose. "We must allow the day to continue now," she said. "The truth has been spoken. The rest is for the law and for conscience to manage." As she walked toward the door, she glanced at each face, her eyes kind yet discerning. "Remember," she said softly, "the smallest details, the tiniest gestures, can hold the greatest secrets, and sometimes it is these secrets that reveal the most about the human heart." She stepped into the sunlight, the warmth falling upon her like a benediction. Behind her, the village began to breathe more freely. The tangled web of deception had been lifted, leaving clarity where confusion had once reigned. And Miss Marple, as always, walked calmly homeward, her sharp mind already considering the next puzzle, the next secret, the next truth that the world might try to conceal, but never completely succeed in hiding. The village of St. Mary Mead had returned to its quiet rhythm, yet an invisible tremor lingered in the air. Doors opened more cautiously, conversations carried the weight of recent revelations, and even the laughter of children seemed touched with awareness. The shocking events surrounding Lily Harrow's death and the exposure of Mr. Larcher's duplicity had left an indelible mark, though life, inevitably, continued. Miss Marple walked along the familiar lanes, her steps measured and serene, her shawl wrapped snugly against the crisp autumn breeze. The villagers passed her with polite nods, some whispering among themselves, but none dared interrupt. News of the final revelation had spread, and with it a mix of relief, suspicion, and lingering curiosity. She stopped briefly at the churchyard, where Lily Harrow now rested beneath a modest gravestone, fresh flowers laid carefully by grateful neighbors. Miss Marple observed silently, noting the tender respect in every gesture. Though the young woman's life had been cut short, her courage and foresight had prevented further deceit and harm. Even in death, she had guided the village toward truth. The vicar, Reverend Whitcomb, approached, carrying a small stack of parish letters. His expression was grave, but softened by quiet satisfaction. "Miss Marple," he said, falling into step beside her, "the village owes you a debt beyond measure. Your careful observations, your patience, and your understanding of human nature revealed what none of us could discern alone." Miss Marple inclined her head. "The village owes itself, Reverend. Courage comes in many forms. Lily and Lydia played their parts, albeit quietly. And people like Mr. Larch, who underestimate the small and subtle, often reveal themselves without realizing it." The Reverend nodded, looking toward the cottages scattered along the lane. "Do you think things will ever be the same?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perhaps outwardly, yes. But the shadow of understanding lingers. People have glimpsed how fragile appearances can be, how quickly deception may hide behind a pleasant smile or a courteous word. It is a lesson that will remain, subtly shaping their actions and choices." As they walked, the village began to hum with ordinary activity. Mrs. Price tended her roses with more care than ever, gossiping quietly with a neighbor about trivial matters, yet aware of the weight behind words. The bakery smelled of fresh bread, the clatter of pans and cheerful chatter serving as a comforting balm to those still unsettled by recent events. Even young Tommy delivered milk with an added spring in his step, as though life's routine had reclaimed its small victories. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the village green, observing a group of women chatting while their children played nearby. Each smile, each gesture, carried a hint of wariness, a subtle acknowledgement that beneath the serene surface, human hearts were complex, layered, and sometimes dangerous. She thought of Mr. Larch, whose duplicity had seemed so perfect, so carefully constructed. Yet even the most cunning of men could not escape the quiet scrutiny of attentive eyes, nor the predictable slips of human emotion. It was a comforting truth, and one she had seen repeatedly over the years. Nothing, however cleverly concealed, could withstand the steady observation of those who understood the nuances of character. The wind rustled through the leaves of the old elm trees, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and the lingering echo of the past week's upheaval. Miss Marple inhaled deeply, appreciating the clarity that followed chaos. Even tragedy had a place in the natural order, serving as a reminder of both human frailty and resilience. She continued toward her own cottage, where the kettle was already singing on the stove. Inside, the familiar warmth and order awaited her. Her knitting neatly arranged, books stacked on the shelves, and the quiet hum of a world undisturbed by her presence, at least for the moment. Miss Marple seated herself by the window, picking up her needles again. As the rhythmic click-click filled the room, she reflected on the events that had transpired. Lily Harrow had been brave in her quiet way, Lydia Graves cautious yet honest, and Mr. Larch's arrogance and meticulous planning had ultimately undone him. The smallest gestures, unnoticed by most, had revealed the largest truths. Her thoughts drifted to the villagers, their lives intertwined in a web of secrets, relationships, and hidden motives. It was human nature, after all, to conceal, to manipulate, and to fear. Yet it was also human nature to reveal, to act bravely, and to uphold truth when guided by wisdom and insight. Miss Marple understood both, and in her quiet observations, she saw the delicate balance between the two. A knock at the door startled her from her reflection. It was Lydia Graves, carrying a small basket of freshly baked bread as a gesture of gratitude. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "I wanted to thank you for everything, for seeing what I could not, and for helping Lily, even after she was gone." Miss Marple accepted the bread with a small nod. "You did well, my dear. You acted as best you could, and that is always what matters." Lydia smiled, her tension easing. "I shall try to be braver in the future." "As we all must," Miss Marple said gently. "Bravery takes many forms, and sometimes it begins with simply paying attention to what others overlook." After Lydia departed, Miss Marple returned to her window. The village settled around her, a scene of tranquility mixed with the quiet awareness of the week's events. She sipped her tea and allowed herself a small, contented smile. The world was often more complex than it seemed, but in its complexity lay both danger and beauty, deceit and revelation. Outside, the last rays of the sun faded, leaving St. Mary Mead bathed in a soft, golden twilight. The village would continue to hum with life, unaware of the delicate threads of observation and insight that had unraveled a mystery and restored order. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the horizon. She thought of human nature, its strengths, its weaknesses, and the subtle patterns that revealed themselves to those patient enough to notice. Life, she knew, was a series of small gestures, quiet decisions, and fleeting expressions, all waiting for someone to pay attention. And she, in her unassuming way, always did. With that thought, she returned to her knitting, the click of the needles a soothing rhythm, a meditation on a world where truth, however elusive, could always be discerned by those who watched closely and acted wisely. The village slept peacefully that night, though forever changed, and Miss Marple, calm and perceptive as ever, looked out her window one final time before the darkness fully claimed the day, content in the knowledge that justice, subtle, patient, and inevitable, had been served. The girl who smiled at death draws to a quiet, contemplative close, leaving the reader with a sense of both resolution and lingering reflection. In the serene village of St. Mary Mead, life resumes its gentle rhythms, yet the shadows of recent events remain, a subtle reminder that human nature is rarely simple. Miss Marple, as always, demonstrates that the greatest mysteries are often solved not through force or dramatic confrontation, but through careful observation, patience, and an intimate understanding of character. She sees what others overlook, the trembling hand, the fleeting glance, the tiny gesture that betrays truth. In this story, it is these small details, the pearl buttons, the forged letter, the behavior of Lydia Graves, and the hidden movements of Mr. Larch, that reveal the depth of deception and guide justice to its inevitable conclusion. The story also reminds us that courage manifests in many forms. Lily Harrow, though silenced too soon, leaves behind signs that, when noticed, direct the way to the truth. Lydia's quiet bravery ensures that the final pieces of the puzzle reach those who can act upon them. Miss Marple's subtle interventions illuminate the moral center of the tale. Even in a world capable of deceit and manipulation, attentiveness, honesty, and courage can restore order. Finally, the village of St. Mary Mead returns to outward tranquility, but the experience leaves a lasting impression. The events of the story serve as a gentle warning. Appearances can deceive. Even the most ordinary people may harbor secrets, and the consequences of human behavior, kindness or malice, often ripple far beyond immediate comprehension. Miss Marple's reflections at the close of the tale reinforce the timeless truth of her detective philosophy. Life, with all its complexities, can always be understood if one watches carefully and considers the subtleties of human nature. In observing, listening, and patiently piecing together small truths, justice, quiet, meticulous, and inevitable, prevails. In The Girl Who Smiled at Death, Agatha Christie's enduring themes of morality, perception, and the subtle power of human insight shine through, leaving readers with a story that is both satisfying in its resolution and resonant in its meditation on the intricacies of life, death, and the human heart.